The idea of a $1 million automobile is something that has fascinated, inspired, and enamored car enthusiasts, especially aspirational ones, for a very long time. I know for me, growing up, as I fell in love with the idea of the automobile, the idea of seeing a $1 million car, or touching one, or sitting in one, or driving one, was one of those goals that you always sort of cling to and hope for. And, having been in contact with many of them, you always see the auctions and the news and the things like that. It's a really, really inspiring part of the hobby. And, we just saw the massive news story about RM Sotheby's selling a Ferrari 330 LM/250 GTO just a couple of weeks ago for nearly $52 million with the fees. And in the wake of the publicity of that sale, I actually got a phone call from Steve Leto, the Lemon Law attorney that we've had on here several times. And he said, "Ed, did you see the story about the GTO?" I said, "Of course I did. I think it's super duper cool. And I honestly thought it might have brought a little bit more money, but there were some caveats with that car and things like that." He said, "Well, I grew up right next door to that car. My neighbor was actually the person that found the car, learned of all the significance and the provenance, restored it and everything else." And he said, in fact, that guy had sold it around 1980 for $1 million. Now, somebody who missed out on the next $50 million of appreciation might have been pretty upset, but that prompted me to go out and say, well, what else could you have done with $1 million since 1980? And since that time, the stock market has actually returned 12,000%. So that $1 million, if you invested it in 1980, would be worth $120 million today with the average stock market return since then. Now, of course, this is the poster child of automotive appreciation, and it didn't live up to the hype. But if you had invested just a few years later in the mid-80s, it would have been more like 80 million. Still, it is ultra rare for a car to beat the stock market for any significant period of time. Now, I was also talking recently with Matthew Ivanhoe, the cultivated collector who helped me find the Yakuza Lamborghini Diablo SV that we're in the process of sort of bringing back to life with Doucet. And he said that the first recorded $1 million car transaction that he's heard about was in the late 1970s. And it was in fact the founder of Domino's Pizza buying a Bugatti Royale. So his speculation was that $1 million GTO would actually have to have been maybe even later into the 80s. So who knows? But regardless, cars are not necessarily an investment to beat the stock market, but as they do appreciate and increase in value, it's one of those things that can offset the ownership cost, offset the interest cost of the money, and to let it be a whole lot more fun and a whole lot more sustainable to enjoy the cars that we love. Now, 5 years ago in 2018, I teamed up with Dan Doucet, the researcher that we've used for a lot of amazing projects here on VINwiki, along with John Tamarian of Curated and Doug Tabbitt from Switch Cars, to try to put together a spreadsheet of exactly or approximately how many $1 million cars there were on Earth at that point. And we were able to add it up to about 20,300 cars, which was crazy, especially since we also tried to look back 15 years to 2003, essentially right before the Ferrari Enzo came out, because that was more than 500 cars, as we have now learned, worth more than $1 million immediately, even though the MSRP was only $660,000. And so essentially, if you look at it, 03, there were just over 1,400 $1 million cars on Earth. So a change from 1,400 to 20,000 in the span of 15 years. And so the question we set out to solve in this video today is, since then, in the last 5 years, how many more are there? But as you might imagine, it's not terribly easy to find out information about $1 million cars, and especially about their owners, because they are very private people. Which is the perfect segue to our sponsor of this video, Aura. Aura is the perfect way to protect yourself and your privacy online. We all get robocalls and we see strange unsolicited spam emails and things like that, and that is because there are data brokers constantly selling your private information around the internet. Aura helps you to take control of that. Now, a lot of us protect ourselves through antivirus software and ad blockers and pop-up blockers and credit monitoring services and VPNs and things like that. Aura brings all of that into a single place and one service that you need to protect yourself online. They're able to submit opt-out requests on your behalf and requests to have other information taken down that you might find when you Google your name or your phone number or your address or any of the things that we would love not to be easily found by strangers or people looking to buy it. So check out Aura now at the link in the description below, or by going to aura.com/VINwiki. They're going to give you a 2-week free trial to show you exactly what they find, what is out there, and exactly how they can help you to take it down and protect yourself on the internet. I know for me, I'm always trying to see what's out there, ask for it to be taken down, use Google alerts and things like that, but Aura wraps it all into one seamless service. So please check them out. It's so important for you to manage what's out there to avoid identity theft, unwanted calls, unwanted emails, and to be as safe as you possibly can online. Again, go to aura.com/VINwiki for a free 2-week trial and make sure that you are as safe as you can be as you're out there and your information is out there on the internet. But again, this is about finding out how many million-dollar cars there are on Earth today. When we look back to 2003, most of the million-dollar cars were Mercedes 540Ks, SSKs, Ferrari 250s, and McLaren F1s. That made up most of these 1,400 or so million-dollar cars. Then, of course, we have hypercars being built, lots of new cars, and a ton of cars appreciating over the next 15 years to get to about 20,000 number that we found back in 2018. And so the question is, what are the new cars? Now, certainly in the last 5 years, we have seen the completion of production for a lot of million-dollar cars. The Bugatti Chiron, the new Ford GTs that weren't necessarily starting at $1 million, but quickly became near as makes no difference $1 million. And we're nearing the end of the production of the Pagani Huayra. Now, Pagani and Koenigsegg and a lot of other car manufacturers are introducing new cars. And so those cars were also adding to the list. But for me, the most interesting thing to look at and notice as we see which cars are being added to the list is the cars that were already built in 2018 and weren't $1 million, but they are now. Because again, I've talked about, for me, the only way that I can afford the cars that I have is if they don't lose value. And so trying to understand what criteria, what factors, what ideas make a car continue to appreciate is what makes this useful for me in making my own car buying decisions. I'm allergic to depreciation, as I've told you many times, but for me, looking at the cars that were now on the list that weren't is the most fun of any of this. And certainly now we see the Porsche Carrera GTs, a lot of really interesting ultra high-end, even modern 911, some of these paint to sample RS4Os and things like that. Now, those are a little harder for me to personally understand, but of course, we also see a lot of new Lamborghinis that are on the list that were already built in 2018, but just weren't remotely of that value. Back then, we were pretty much just looking at a handful of one-off cars plus the Miura SVs. Now we've got all the Miuras plus the top-tier Countach, Diablo, and Murcielagos. And so Lamborghini represents a lot of these new cars that weren't worth $1 million then, but are worth $1 million now. So today, the total that we found, and again, we don't have every chassis itemized, we're estimating give or take, but it was 29,722 vehicles, nearly 30,000 cars, and a 50% increase from the number that we tabulated back in 2018, just 5 years ago. So that means that every day over the last 5 years, a little more than 5 cars have gone from not being worth $1 million and now being worth more than $1 million. That's a pretty crazy thing to imagine, and it's something we probably shouldn't expect to stop anytime soon. Inflation where it is, the availability of loans and debt from banks like Premier Financial Services to make it easier than ever to buy these cars, own these cars, drive these cars, and honestly, the number of these cars that most owners own. Now, it'd be very impossible for us to accurately estimate the average number of $1 million cars that a $1 million car owner owns. Now that's quite a tongue twister, but essentially saying that if you own $1 million car, you got to imagine you probably own 10, or these are collections that might have 100. We've done a lot of appraisals for these big collections from celebrities and influencers where there are just tons and tons of cars that you would not necessarily imagine just seeing the optics of most of these collections. Now this also represents 30,000 $1 million cars is $30 billion, but clearly the average value of $1 million car is not $1 million. It's probably more like $3 or $4 million. So near as makes no difference, $100 billion being tied up in the asset class of $1 million cars. Now recently, Doug DeMuro made a really cool video that I personally enjoyed where he compared the market cap, meaning the total production times the average value of various models across the collectible car spectrum. And I thought that was a really fascinating concept. Now I do think there are some flaws with the logic. There is clearly a difference in market preference between an F40 or a 300 SL versus a Veyron or something like that. That just, we can't necessarily say there should be equal funds available for each of these cars. But in thinking through that logic, I am personally fascinated by the relative market cap of each investable or collectible brand. So for instance, if you look at our spreadsheet, almost all of the cars are Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Porsches, McLarens, or Mercedes. So those 5 brands really do represent most of the big money collectible cars. The other ones are in such small quantities that we don't necessarily think they matter in terms of being reflective of what the car collecting public is really willing to invest their fortune in many of these cases. And so I'd like to do a video where I'm able to kind of spend some time totaling up how much I think is invested in each of those brands. Not in the modern stuff, we'd stop at whatever the most recently collectible hypercar is, I suppose, but that may be the next research project for me and Dan to undertake. But when we think about the idea of $1 million car, what are the takeaways here? Primarily, it is that rarity prevails. All of these cars were produced in quantities of less than 2,500, most of them less than 200, some of them less than 20. So clearly, the more rare a car is, the more likely it is to eventually become worth $1 million. There's also a significance to each of these cars, not just within the brands that they represent, but within their contemporaries, within the cars that were built around the same time. It was a technology, a performance, an aesthetic, a significant, whatever it is that made the car so special. That's what made people who couldn't afford them but were dreaming about them one day save enough, or flip their way up through them in my case, to be able to afford one of these cars. Look, cars are not a great investment relative to the stock market, but as we said, offsetting the maintenance cost, the interest cost, and all the other expenses that are involved in running a car by having the car go up in value is a wonderful way to mitigate your cost of a hobby that we all love so very much. But the real takeaway, of course, is that for all of the $1 million cars there are out there to dream after, there's more and more every single day. Once again, I'd like to thank today's video sponsor, Aura. Aura is the perfect way for you to protect your privacy and your data online. Data brokers are transacting in your phone number, your address, your email address all of the time, and you can stop that with Aura. They help you stop robocalls, spam emails, and all the other things that identity thieves are out there trying to buy about you. They can submit opt-out notices or takedown requests on your behalf. So check them out now at the link in the description below. They're giving all of our subscribers 2 weeks free at aura.com/VINwiki.